Now we're going to pick up from when I saw you guys last time, where things things in the Philippines on the Bataan Peninsula get real bad real fast. What this is really showing, big picture, is that there's nothing we can do to stop the Japanese. But we got to do something. We're on the map. We've got to get up. Now, we talked about before how there's really only one class of ships that we really still have within the Pacific that's really functional. Remember, what are those ships the Japanese missed at Pearl Harbor? Those aircraft carriers. But you have to kind of keep in mind with all these decisions, that's really all we've got. It's the only thing protecting the West Coast is those 3 carriers. Now, yes, those carriers allow us to project power a long way away. As we've talked about, even in Europe, air power is really the future of naval warfare. It's those carriers that are incredibly important. But we got to hit Japan back. So here's the gamble. Do we send one of those carriers out into the Pacific on the way to the Japanese home islands in an attempt to try to hit them back? Or do we keep them in? This is the gamble. Because if we lose one of those carriers, we're in a whole lot of trouble. Now, I just kind of want to paint this in a particular light. I was telling you guys before, we really have 3 carriers in the Pacific. That's it. By this time, the Japanese have, at least large carriers, they've got 5. So the score is 5-3. We're willing to risk one of these carriers to get a victory in the Pacific. So we got to kind of think this through. How do we want to get our victory? Now, maybe a good idea would be to take one of these small islands the Japanese have taken. Maybe we try to take the Philippines back. That's not a bad idea. We need to think bold, though. We need to think big. The plan we're going to come up with is nicknamed the Doolittle Raid. Now, it's done this because the person who's in charge is Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle has an idea where he says, why would we worry about hitting one of those small islands in the Pacific? Why would we go back to the Philippines? I want something grander than that. Let's hit the Japanese home islands. And when Doolittle suggests this, there are a lot of people that are saying, that's just not possible. You've lost your mind. You want to take one of our carriers and get it close enough to Japan to hit them. You're going to have to bypass all these other islands that they control. So how do you want to do this? And what Doolittle comes up with is this idea where he says, if we can just get close enough, if we can have this carrier 400 miles off the coast of Japan, we can hit the Japanese and then land our bombers in China. Now I'll go ahead and pose this to you guys. If you want to hit the Japanese, you got to be about 400 miles off the coast. You got to be about there. Anyone else see a potential problem here?
They're close to everything.
You're close. You're in the middle of everything. And the plan is, we're going to hit Japan and then fly on to China. Anyone see a problem here too?
That's a long distance.
That's a long way. So here you have these higher commanders say, well, how do you want to do this? Because you want to have a bomber on an aircraft carrier, right? And Doolittle just says, yes, we're going to have B-25 bombers on these carriers. A B-25 is basically like a mid-sized kind of bomber. It's pretty big, it's fat, it's heavy, and it's designed to take off on a runway. These planes are designed to take about a mile give or take about a mile to get enough speed to get its fat body off the ground and into the air. An aircraft carrier, its flight deck is about 1,000 feet. So it's about a fifth as long as what these bombers need to take off. Does anyone see a problem with that? What's the problem? What's gonna happen?
They're not gonna have enough speed.
You don't have enough speed, so you just dump off into the ocean. I'll be the first one to say it. I don't like this idea. I think it's a terrible idea. I think you're gonna risk pilots, you're gonna risk planes, and you're gonna risk the carrier. So let's go a little further here, Jimmy. How do you wanna do this? He goes, we're just gonna make these planes as light as possible. We are gonna strip off everything from these planes that's not absolutely necessary. We're gonna drop these planes by hundreds, if not thousands of pounds. Strip everything. Get all the armor off, get all the guns out of there, get all the seats out of there. Everything's gotta go. I see some of you, that sounds bad. Yeah, everything's gotta go. And what Doolittle's gonna say is, I need my pilots to go to the bathroom before they get in these planes. Ounces count. This is our plan. This is how we're gonna try to hit the Japanese. Now what Doolittle says is, we're gonna bomb a handful of Japanese factories. Now I do wanna ask, why are we going after factories?
Because then they can't produce
Because it can't produce, so let's hit the factories. Now, if we have these handful of B-25s hitting the factories, is it gonna cripple the Japanese? No. We've got 16 planes. We're gonna hit the factories. Is it gonna cripple them? No, far from it. But psychologically, is this big?
Yes.
We're gonna let the Japanese know we can hit them when we want to. Now, this is a huge gamble. And what Doolittle has done, as far as the math goes, he says, we gotta get 400 miles off the coast of Japan. If we can get 400 miles off the coast, we can launch, hit the Japanese, and then we'll go land in China. That's gonna work for us. But he's got a big problem. On the way to Japan, by sheer just luck, really, there's a Japanese scout plane that's just flying over the Pacific. The scout plane happens to see the USS Hornet, and he sees us when we're about 650 miles off the coast. Now, we know that he saw us. We are well aware of this. So now it's decision time. Do you launch, or do you turn around and go home? 650 miles off the coast. That's a big distance to go. If we launch now, even if the bombers can get off the deck, now they gotta go and hit Japan, and they're probably not gonna have enough fuel to get to China. Probably gonna crash into the Sea of Japan. What do you wanna do? Anyone else see a problem here? Doolittle says now. We launch now. We launch before that Japanese pilot can radio back where we are. We gotta go, and we gotta do it right now. Launch those B-25s. Don't forget, go to the bathroom before you get in there. We gotta hit Japan back. Here you have the first pilot on deck. It's actually this one right here. He's told, get in, and when you get in there, you go full throttle. Push everything you got because feet matter. You better get to a high enough speed to lift off the deck. If you don't, you're going into the Pacific and no one's gonna find you. Your turn. They climb into their bomber. First one pushes it, throttle all the way forward. He's going down the flight deck. He gets to the edge of the of the flight deck, and his plane starts to fall. Until it goes up. It picks up. Now, if you're the second one in line, are you feeling better about it?
Yeah.
Feeling better? I'd still be terrified, but let's go. Throttle all the way forward. He gets to the end of flight deck, guess what? Starts sinking. And then? It goes up. Pulls up. All of them get off the flight deck. Every one of them is now on the way to Japan. Now, again, you have to remember, we're just looking to hit some factories. It's not a huge blow by any means. In fact, it's just a pinprick. But it's right where we want it to be. They're going to hit these factories in Tokyo, and the Japanese are stunned by what's happening. They thought they controlled the Pacific, and they do, but we just hit them back. Is it going to crush production? No, far from it. But psychologically, now the Japanese know that we can hit them when we want. Should the Japanese be a little nervous? Yes. They got to go get those carriers. They knock the carriers out. They control the Pacific. So they start making some plans. And in fact, actually, some very clever plans. How do we draw those carriers out? How can we figure out exactly where they're going to be at the right time? They come up with a plan that's actually very clever. Yes, Ken?
You go back.
The plan that they have in place is we need some bait. We need to bring those carriers out at a time and place when we're ready. So they look at the map and they make their choice. What they find is the perfect spot to pull these carriers out is going to be at Midway. Now, Midway is this tiny little island in the Pacific. Midway is right here. And the only real thing about Midway that makes it intriguing is that it's big enough to build a runway on. If you control Midway, you now have the capacity to hit the Hawaiian Islands with heavy bombers round the clock. This is within their range. You take off from Midway, bomb Hawaii, come back, refuel, reload, back to Hawaii. Controlling Midway means the Japanese would be one step away from controlling Hawaii. This is why this is such a good idea. They need to draw those carriers out, and they want to be certain they know exactly when and how they're going to be there. So in June of 42, we're going to see the Battle of Midway take place. Now this again, big gambles, massive gambles taking place here. The Japanese believe that if they can secure Midway, the U.S. will have no choice but to bring the carriers out. Knock out the carriers, Japanese control the Pacific, Hawaii, and the West Coast. That's the stakes here. The fate of the world is at hand. Now we got to be careful, because if we lose those carriers, we're in a lot of trouble. But there is good news. We have figured out the Japanese naval codes. Now I will tell you this, and without getting into specifics here, everything that's done over the radio is done in code. Because it's actually fairly simple to intercept radio waves, and if you're just calling out orders normally, why would that be such a bad thing for the enemy to know what you're doing? Because they can plan ahead, certainly. So everything's done in code. The Japanese had a really, really complicated code. Now, without getting into the specifics of that, I will tell you, the math that it takes to figure this out is extraordinarily high-level math. Because every code that they would send out could be decoded in 1 of 1 times 10 to the 24th power waves. 24 zeros. That's how complex it is. It takes some very clever people to figure out how the code works. We crack the code, and now you're in a weird spot. We know the Japanese are planning to go to Midway. What happens if we just send everyone on to Midway?
Destroy it.
They'll know that we cracked their code.
They'll know we cracked the code. They'll just change it after that. So you gotta play a delicate game here. You can't let them know that you cracked the code or they'll just change it. You gotta kind of play along. Now, phase 1 of the Japanese plan is, we're gonna send a diversion force. We're gonna make it look like we're moving on the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. They send this small naval force up north to make it seem like they want to take Alaska. Now again, let's sort of play through this a little bit. Is it really within their purview? Would it make sense for them to take Alaska? An American, well, will be staying.